So yeah, we've seen the Buddha born into very fortunate circumstances. He had everything. That's how the story kind of comes to us. Very, very fortunate. There's a whole story behind that, but yeah, he had everything, but he wasn't satisfied. He wasn't actually satisfied by it. That kind of uncomfortable discrepancy when your whole environment is telling you you should be happy, you should be satisfied, but his inner experience was that he wasn't. He was restless, and that led him to leave the palace, leave the confines of his familiar, known, habitual sort of walks of life, and walk out. And as we heard earlier, he encountered 4 sights. That's how the story comes to us, of old age, sickness, and death. The first 3, and we're told that he hadn't seen them before. Perhaps one way of relating to that is that it's as though he saw them for the first time. He saw them and they really went in a way that for us, it doesn't go in, does it? We see it, but we don't believe it. Surely that's not going to happen to me, but it went in for him. And then beautifully told the story of the 4th sight, we heard that earlier, which precipitates a shift. He has to go. He has to leave his life. He has to go forward into the jungle as a wandering mendicant. So that's what he does. He leaves behind his very, very privileged, fortunate position and becomes a nobody. So he, when he does that, he looks out, he finds the teachers of the day, the great spiritual teachers of the day, and he applies himself and he excels in the teachings of the day. But he's still not satisfied by that. He leaves those communities because they haven't answered the questions of his heart. They haven't answered the issues of old age, sickness, and death. So that happens twice before he has a complete change of tack, and he gets into what's called asceticism, which was very prevalent at that time. This idea that if you mortify the flesh, you can kind of get beyond the trappings of the flesh. So he applied himself very, very thoroughly, vigorously to that. Sounds completely mad to us, but that's what happened. That was what was available to him. And at a certain point, he gives up on that as well. He realizes he's no closer to answering his questions. And he has a memory. He has a memory from his childhood of a moment where he's sitting beneath a tree, a very busy time of year, the time of ploughing. The ploughing is going on before him, but he is just still. And in that moment, he gets effortlessly absorbed. His mind just stills and becomes more and more concentrated without even sort of trying to do it. He just becomes effortlessly absorbed. And he remembers this moment, and he has a sort of intuition that that is the way. Neither the pursuit of pleasure, which he tried, nor the sort of mortification of the flesh. And this is where the teaching of the middle way, famous teaching of Buddhism, kind of comes from. But it's based on an intuition. Really interesting, that, isn't it? It's based on a kind of intuition. So he takes food. And he goes to the foot of a tree, and he determines, may flesh wither, may blood dry up, but I will not move from this spot until I gain enlightenment. That's what he says. So up until now, we've got the story, the sort of historical story of a human being, a historical human being, but then the language modulates. So what happens next is, as he sits and meditates beneath the tree, Mara turns up. Now, Mara is like the Buddhist version of Satan. So he turns up with a whole army of ugly-looking beings that chuck things at him, throw javelins and spears and rocks, severed heads. It gets really ugly. And what the Buddha does is he just sits there impassive, and those things that are thrown, those projectiles, when they reach the Buddha, they turn into flowers and fall to the floor. And then Mara sends his daughters, Lust and Desire, to try and move him from his spot. Again, he is unmoved. And then another episode, Mara tries a different approach. So Mara instead says, Gautama, who are you to sit there on the seat of enlightenment? Who are you? And the Buddha responds to that enigmatically by simply touching the ground with his right hand. And at that point, the earth goddess arises and bears witness to his lifetimes of practice, which is the answer to that question, that questioning of Mara. And then the next episode we learn of is the Buddha is wavering. The Buddha is wondering, is it possible to teach what I have discovered? Is it possible to teach the Dharma? Will people understand it? It will be wearisome for me. And at that moment, Brahma Sahampati appears. Now, who is he? He's like the sort of god of the gods. And he urges the Buddha, he says, there are people who will understand. There are people with little dust on their eyes who, if they hear it, will see the Dharma, will understand the Dharma. And the Buddha is moved by this plea. And what happens in the episode is he sees a vision of humanity as a lake of lotuses, all lotuses, all the same, but some are buried deep down in the mud, closed. Some are emerging up from the mud into the water, and some have come out completely above the water. And that is the Buddha's sort of answer, as it were, in this episode. That somehow communicates the Buddha's realization of the potential of all beings to grow, to be receptive to Dharma. So that's the story. There's one more, but I won't tell you that one as yet. So that is the story so far. We've come to the end of the story. And as you'll see, there's quite a shift in language, isn't there? we were moving along quite nicely, quite fairly believably in literal truth. And then there's this shift of language into symbol, into the imaginal. What do we make of this? Because it can be a bit of a sort of, can even be a bit of a turn-off Depends, can be for me, actually, if I'm in a sort of literal state of mind. I've sort of been brought up to believe that those kind of symbolic episodes are kind of simplifications for the unsophisticated kind of simple mind, so that they can understand truths that are way beyond them. That's a kind of view that I've been brought up with in the West. Religion as the opiate of the people. And if I'm in a literal sort of state of mind, actually I can slightly sort of recoil when I get to that sort of shift. So what are we to make of it? Well, I was reading this book, Ratnaguna is the Writer, Great Faith, Great Wisdom, and I came across something which I found really, really interesting. He said that he thinks actually the people of that time wouldn't have made a hard and fast distinction between literal truth, between the literal and the imaginative. That kind of hard and fast distinction that's so obvious to us wouldn't have been so hard and fast for them. So I was really struck by that. He says, for them, symbols, metaphors, supernatural stories, and myths were not a different kind of truth from what we call literal truth. They lived in a spiritual or animistic world in which states of mind and places were not separate categories. Isn't that kind of fascinating? And I guess we've no idea quite what it'd be like to live like that. It's utterly, you can sort of just about imagine it, can't you, if you get imaginative, but it's sort of, it's a bit unimaginable to us. It is a different mind. And that's the mind that the Buddha was speaking to. So what would the Buddha say to us? What would the Buddha say to our people with our mindsets, a modern sort of mindset? Well, perhaps, maybe he might say to us, we can go no further in this story unless you develop your imagination. We can go no further in this story unless you develop your imagination. So it's a bit like we might be in danger of sort of assuming that that people back then were sort of less well equipped than us, but actually maybe they were better equipped for understanding what happened when the Buddha sat down. Maybe they were better equipped than us for understanding what happened when the Buddha sat down beneath a tree than we are. And the Buddha might confront us with that and say, we can go no further in this story unless you develop your imagination. That's a kind of modern, he certainly didn't say it in the scriptures, but that's because he was speaking to different people. What would he say to us? What would he say to us? Well, this is something that Sangharakshita, our founder, my teacher, has drawn out the importance of the imagination. So that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about what is the imagination and what isn't it. What is the particular value or capacity of the imagination, and why do we need it in the spiritual path, on the spiritual path? Yeah, so those three questions. Okay, so three things that imagination isn't. It's not fantasy. So yeah, perhaps I should step back a little bit. This word imagination, it does need a bit of explaining because it's been it's been kind of degraded in our culture. Can even just sort of sound like something that's sort of the status of kind of the entertainment industry. Or maybe it means like, you know, you've got funny thoughts in your head that aren't really real, you know, you're just imagining that. Well, we need to sort of lift it up a bit to understand why the Buddha might say to us, and, you know, you need to develop your imagination. So what it's not fantasy. So fantasy is fundamentally about wish fulfillment. So when we're fantasizing, we're kind of fantasizing about the life that we'd like to have, but don't, yeah, and we're not doing anything about it. That's fantasy. That's what fantasy is. So that's not what imagination is. And then there's this term fancy, which comes from the Romantic poet Coleridge. And it's not that either. So what is fancy? Well, fancy's about rearranging the usual contents of experience in new arbitrary combinations. So fancy can be brilliant, even virtuosic, but it fails to embody deeper perception or imaginative truth. That's fancy. So, you know, the sort of classic example of, I don't know, an architectural building that's got a kind of pig's nose on the top of it, something. It's kind of arbitrary combinations. You might think that's really imaginative. Well, no, not in this term. That's kind of fancy. There's a lot around that's sort of mere fancy, but it doesn't actually embody deeper perception or imaginative truth. And then the other thing is, it's not necessarily about the arts. It's not necessarily about images. For example, you can have a sense of the presence of the Buddha, a vivid sense of the presence of the Buddha without any image sort of content. You can just sort of feel sort of kinesthetically the presence of the Buddha. Well, that is imagination. That's your imagination. But it's not necessarily about images or even the arts. So what is it about? What are we talking about? Well, the imagination, an experience of imagination is when something beyond us starts to come into play. So something beyond our kind of known capacities, abilities, something beyond what we know to be ourself starts to come into play. So perhaps a little example of this in my experience that might help open this up. So back in lockdown, we were doing loads of Dharma activities. People were really sort of hungry for Buddhism and meditation. And I was preparing a talk, and I pretty much got it finished. I put it down. I went outside for a walk, as we were allowed to, one of our few freedoms back then. And I thought, there's something missing. There's something missing in this talk. And I thought, I know what it is. Why, you know, I'd sort of constructed this talk, but why, how is this relevant? I slightly overlooked that, which is kind of important, isn't it? But I didn't really have time to sort of write it out, to draft it out. So I was kind of on the hoof, and I went into the talk, and I was mid sort of explaining that, and very unsettling experience. This word forced itself into my mind. A word forced itself into my mind. It was the word unmitigated. I was mid sort of explaining something, and it just sort of forced itself into my mind. And at that moment, I had no idea what that word meant. I was familiar with it, but actually at that moment, I had no idea what it meant. So I was proceeding through the sentence. This is in a matter of sort of about a second or a second and a half or something like that. I was proceeding through the sentence, and it was coming up to the point where I needed to use that word or another word. And I was thinking, I don't know what it means. I'm not going to, am I just going to sort of, you know, this is mad. What's going on? And just before that point came, I remembered what it meant. And it was just the right word. It was just the right word to use. But it was a very strange experience. It was not me that had deliberated over, you know, what word shall I use here? It just forced itself into my mind, into my consciousness, it's sort of, I hadn't put it there. something else was happening. Slightly unnerving experience when you're in front of a load of people trying to look like you know what you're talking about. Yeah, so it was just a moment where something else came into play. It was a moment where imagination kind of took over. So that's sort of what we're talking about with imagination. But what is the particular value or capacity of it? That's the second question. And I thought I'd just quote, actually, a writer called Aaron Hughes, who gives us the answer. He says, the imagination is the faculty that experiences and expresses in sensible form that which is essentially inexpressible. The imagination is the faculty that experiences and expresses in sensible form that which is essentially inexpressible. So that's the particular sort of value here in our story. That's why the Buddha's going, we can go no further, because what he's saying is actually at the end of the day inexpressible. It can't be conveyed in concepts. It's sort of inconceivable. So you may have had that experience. Probably most of us have at some point had that experience. For me, when I was thinking about this, my mind went back to a festival day we were having at the centre a good number of years ago, probably, God, 23, 4, 5 years ago. And we had this enormous, like 5-metre standing drape, what do you call it, of tapestry sort of thing, of
embroidery.
Yeah. The big red one with Amitabha on.
Oh,
it was a tanker, yeah, but it's not a painting. Well, it's a piece of material, but it's 5 meters high and about 3 meters across. This just this enormous image, basically, of a Buddha. And we just got to the end. I don't know what we'd done. We'd just been meditating or something like that. And I just looked up at it and it just hit me. It just hit me. I can't tell you what was going on, but I was just transfixed. So I just looked at it and I just looked at it and I just looked at it. It was communicating something to me, but I cannot for the life of me tell you what it was. I really can't tell you what it was. Or at least I can tell you what it was. So this is the sense in which imagination isn't actually sort of beyond, or it isn't sort of irrational. It contains reason and emotion, but sort of lifts them higher. So I was experiencing something of the potential for Buddhahood. There you are. There's a kind of conceptual way of putting it. But if I say that, it's not, it doesn't do justice to the actual experience. There's something more in that imaginal experience that is expressed. Yeah, so it expresses in sensible form something that is inexpressible in conceptual form. So that was my experience of the inexpressible being communicated, being expressed to me. But it just hit me. And it was because of that I decided to become a Mitra. I decided to make a commitment of becoming a Buddhist in this particular community. I couldn't explain, really why that, why that was. Other people seem to understand it without me needing to explain it. But yeah, I couldn't explain why that was. So yeah, that's the sort of that's the capacity that imagination has. What was it? The faculty that experiences and expresses in sensible form that which is essentially inexpressible. I can't say that, can I? So, last question. Why do we need that in the spiritual life? Why are we saying the need for imagination? Why is that the talk, the title of this talk? Well, because in the spiritual life is a path. It's a path of growth and development, and that is necessarily growth from the known, from known experience to the unknown, to unknown experience. If it's sort of a genuine growth in awareness, in consciousness, it's beyond your current experience. That is essentially what the spiritual life is about. So in order to have some sense of where we're going, you need an imagination. You need imagination. That's the only thing that can reach beyond our sort of known experience into and sort of intimate what was inexpressible. So that's true when we're listening to someone like the Buddha talking about his experience, which is outside or beyond our experience. But it's kind of true for us too. For us sort of intimating our own growth. So I guess there's a secondary question that comes up here, which is, you know, say in that experience I was having before the Buddha, how do I know that that's not just sort of a funny fit of indigestion and I just massively misinterpreted it? How do we really sort of know that with this faculty of imagination, we're actually perceiving the truth? It's not just sort of made up mumbo jumbo. How do we kind of know that? And actually, I don't think there is an answer that I can give you for that. I think that's something we need to find out for ourselves. We need to find out, we need to develop our imagination to see in our own experience, is it able to apprehend the truth more fully than the language of concepts? So in my own experience, this penny started to drop a bit more a number of years ago. I mean, as an order member, I was working in a Buddhist business and I was a manager of a number of people. I needed to manage to make decisions about whether they could do this job or could do that job. When I was doing that, when I was sort of assessing people, I'd sort of think through, oh, well, gosh, there's this and there's that. And I'd, you know, I'd found myself coming to the conclusion, well, no, I don't think they can do that job, actually. Having thought about it and sort of where they're at, you know, these are the facts. But at some point, I can't remember how, maybe someone encouraged me, but I thought, let's just imagine, can I imagine them? Can I imagine them doing that job? And what I discovered was I could. It was sort of outside of what they were able to do now, but I could imagine it. This other person, I couldn't. And I started to believe, if you like, in the imagination as a faculty for actually apprehending something true. It's not merely a sort of making up of stuff. I could, for some people, imagine, and for other people, I couldn't imagine. And actually, what I found was that was a more reliable way of making decisions about should I give this person this job or not. So that was just, it's just a little example in my own experience. of learning, a little sort of tiptoe step to learning to, oh gosh, look, actually, imagination is a sort of, has a greater capacity in this situation for apprehending the truth, which doesn't quite exist at the moment. They're not able to do it now, but I think they can. I can imagine them. It's a better faculty. It's a more capable, more effective faculty for actually apprehending that truth. Yeah. So that's just a little example in my own experience, but you have to try it out. You have to discover for yourself what is the capacity of imagination. You have to give it a go. So there we are. I hope I've answered those questions of kind of what is the imagination, what isn't it, and what's a particular value or capacity of it in the spiritual life. Why do we need it? Why do we actually need it? Why might the Buddha say to us, we can go no further in this story, before we start hearing those sort of symbolic episodes in the Buddha's enlightenment. So what I thought we could do is we could try out a bit our imaginations, test drive our imaginations. I thought what we could do is we could actually kind of bring to mind those 3-4 episodes, imaginative, symbolic episodes, and just see what happens. Yeah. Just sort of see what they feel like, just let them be there in our minds, and then let's go a bit more mad, let's do something a bit more imaginative. We'll just chant a mantra. So all we're doing here is sort of moving from the language of concepts squarely into the language of the imagination. Just sound symbol, just in a way to sort of open up a space, an imaginative space, in which our imagination can start to emerge. Yeah, we'll do that. So before that, I'll just say a little bit more about these episodes. Just a few very simple pointers. So what we encounter there with Mara's army and the Buddha, it's really important to realize that we're encountering a consciousness beyond our own. We're encountering enlightened consciousness, a consciousness right at the summit of existence, basically. That's what the Buddha is trying to communicate with that episode. So it's sort of way beyond our experience. You know, you can find a way to relate that to your experience, but if we do that to the exclusion of really opening up to the possibility of a consciousness way beyond our own, we're missing the point. Do you see what I mean? So this is the Buddha's way to try and communicate a consciousness way beyond our own. Yeah, so let's just bear that in mind with that episode. And then I think the other episode I just mentioned, say a word about, is the Buddha and Mara's question to him, who are you? In a way, it's quite familiar. We can imagine ourselves in that position, can't we? But again, it's beyond the familiar. What's being pointed at is beyond the familiar. It's perhaps the last sort of contraction of self going on. Who am I? And then the earth goddess kind of emerges. What is that saying? Well, it's not saying, yes, you're good enough. It's not saying anything personal at all. The ego, self, has completely disappeared at this point. Instead, what it's saying is that enlightenment is natural to existence. It's part of nature. It could have been anybody sitting there. If they had created the conditions that the Buddha had created, if they'd done what the Buddha had done, they would be being enlightened. In that sense, it's sort of impersonal. It's built into the universe. It's natural to the universe that enlightenment can be attained. So how are we doing for time? Just a little word about the episode with Brahma Sahumpati. Who on earth is he? In a way, he sort of represents the known world. He's like the sort of voice piece, if you like, for the known world. And he is saying, we need the Dharma. We need the teaching. That's the sort of role he sort of plays in this. And well, again, sort of what's going on there? Well, it's a bit like what's not going on is that you've got an individual with an ego sort of deliberating over, shall I teach or shall I not? That's not what's going on because there is no ego at all at this point. But what's being kind of pointed at is the response to teach is not a self-deliberated one at all. It is a response to the world. It is a response to the world. So in a certain sense, in the episode, you need someone else to ask the Buddha to teach. Can you see how that's sort of in concrete form truer than him just saying, oh, I was kind of wondering whether I'd, teach or not, and I thought, well, maybe, yeah, I will, that's less true